we are in this position with everything that we want in front of us.
SEC Championship Week.
A lot of people question us about how the year is going, what type of team that we have, and, our abilities and what we can do. And I think, just being able to get in the game says a lot about who we are.
This week on The Beat, Mike's fired up about the Dog Doubters, and we dive into what will be the difference in round 2 with the Longhorns. Let's roll.
Giving you the insider takes and the big picture view on the Dogs. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles with DawgNation insider Mike Griffith and Cody Chaffins.
Hey there, and welcome into On the Beat. Cody Chaffins and Mike Griffith with you. Mike, I got to ask you right off the bat, how are you?
No, I'm good, Cody. It was a great weekend, and probably a lot more Twitter action than I should have had at Mike Griffith 32. It was quite a show between me and the fans from all over the country.
That's why I had to ask. You seemed as fired up as I have seen you online in a long, not ever, but in a long time. And I'm thinking, I see that on Twitter, and I log on to DawgNation.com this morning. You got an article up. Yes, Georgia actually did beat Georgia Tech this week. Yeah. It seemed like you felt like you needed to get that out there. Tell me why.
Well, sometimes the narrative can shift and change based on a lot of people on social media, based on the commentary during the game. And for a long time during the game, it looked like Georgia Tech was going to win. And if you were watching the game, that's all you heard. I mean, you didn't hear the story of Carson Beck waiting 3 years for his chance. And nobody stopped to think, wait a minute, this is the guy that stayed in the program and did it the old-fashioned way. It was all about Haynes King, a guy that had quit one program, started another, had a tremendous performance. But in the end, it was Dirty Dan Jackson that was the oil painting moment, forcing the fumble. It was the Georgia Bulldogs defense rising to the occasion, stopping Tech, Cody. They needed 1 yard in the 7th overtime. That was it. 1 yard for glory for Brent Key, the former lineman, for Haynes King, the heroic performance. And they couldn't get 1 yard on the 93rd play that Georgia defense was on the field. And that, you've got to say something about Georgia's efforts. And there just wasn't enough time after they made that play. Georgia won the next possession. That's it. Everybody rode off into the sunset. And people didn't stop and reflect and say, wait a minute. If Carson Beck hadn't been nearly flawless in the fourth quarter, if he hadn't driven the team down in less than 2 minutes, they didn't ask Kirby Smart about all those timeouts and all those adjustments that enabled Georgia to stop Tech on 5 out of 6 possessions from the 3-yard line or closer. How do you do that if you've given up 260 yards rushing for 60 minutes? And so that plot never really played out. The people that wanted Georgia to lose, everyone not wearing red and black, turned off their television sets. And when they came back to Twitter, all they could say was that Georgia struggled against the 6th place ACC team, Cody. They didn't stop and realize that Tech had only played 1 game in 19 days. They didn't stop and realize that Tech had played the previous Thursday, so they had 2 extra days to perform. They didn't take into account this Georgia team might still have 5 games left. While this was the end of the season for Tech, for all intents and purposes, they're no longer relevant. They could put everything into this emotionally, game plan-wise, players that maybe weren't 100%. Nobody stopped and realized just what it took for Georgia to pull that game out of the fire when it appeared that Buster Faulkner and Haynes King were going to seize the moment.
What did Dennis Green say? You play to win the game. Georgia won the game, but I feel like that's kind of been the way this whole Georgia season has gone. And whether it's been because they've played in a lot of these night games where the nation is watching, I feel like so many of Georgia's games have been picked apart more so than it feels like any other school out there. Even in games they win, the point is to go out there and win. And I feel like Georgia, even from the College Football Playoff Committee, which we will get into later in this show, but it seems like they've been picked apart a lot more by everybody. And I think a lot of it is just because everybody's watching.
Well, I think that is a lot of it. And I think a lot of it is also that Georgia is considered the standard for college football. And this is the program right now that is superior. This is the coach that is number one. But if you think about it, Georgia is kind of a microcosm of college football. When you look at everything the Dogs have dealt with, from the unintended consequences of NIL to, an NIL star player learning to manage his account and manage his team and the locker room dynamics, the ridiculously difficult schedule, which embodies what the SEC's gone through, with top 25 SEC teams having a losing record on the road for the first time in the portal era, probably ever, where that's happened. And it's kind of happened to Georgia. And so everybody's kind of focused in saying, well, they're not as great as they were in 21 or 22. Nobody is. Oregon struggled to beat Wisconsin by a field goal. The same Wisconsin team Bama beat by 30 earlier this year. Nobody is really playing perfect football. The Ohio State, as a 3-touchdown favorite, lost at home to a very mediocre Michigan team that Texas beat in Ann Arbor 31-12. And yet, and still, these people from other conferences and teams, maybe not used to the postseason, they want to pick the SEC apart and say, yeah, but Vanderbilt beat Alabama and Vanderbilt lost to Georgia State and Kentucky beat Ole Miss and, oh gosh, Georgia struggled with this. So the narrative is kind of up for grabs. And my role as a journalist, and yours as well, and everyone at DawgNation and AJC.com, we want to reflect history accurately. And this was a runaway train of Georgia Tech love on Friday night. Somebody had to set the record straight, and that's what we did in that article about the Georgia Bulldogs' 8 overtime win over Georgia Tech on Friday night.
The other thing about it is, when you look at, and we don't know how Georgia's season ends, right? It could end in a couple weeks. It could make it all the way to a championship. But something about championship seasons, you got to have moments like that. My mind went back to 1980 at the cocktail party. Georgia was going to lose to Florida until Lindsey Scott stepped up and ran all the way down the field on a play he shouldn't. Sometimes games like that just have to happen. You think we'll look back on this Nate Frazier, and of course it matters how the season ends, but look back at this Nate Frazier scoring that touchdown, the comeback from 2 touchdowns down with 5 minutes to go. You think we'll look back on that like we do maybe the 1980 cocktail party?
I mean, if Georgia wins the national championship, certainly, the comeback here against Georgia Tech was big for the Dogs, and it was the team coming together. It was just one more moment where this team rose to the occasion. It kind of galvanizes a team when they win in that fashion. And we've seen that time and time again with this Georgia team. We've talked about what is their personality, what is their characteristic, and it's been resiliency. I mean, this is a team that at times we've counted out, said, boy, this just isn't a championship team. This team can't get to the SEC championship game. Let's face it, the loss to Alabama was very disappointing. The first half was a shocker. I think we were all stunned to watch the Crimson Tide race out to a lead, and yet still Georgia came back within a 50-50 pass from Carson Beck of maybe winning that football game. And then the trip to Ole Miss. Georgia, kind of breathing for air after a really difficult stretch against a fired-up Ole Miss team with a very talented front, on kind of a rainy night where it was hard for those offensive linemen to get their footing, and it looked like Ole Miss had almost knocked Georgia out, 28-10. How could the Dogs ever recover? And yet they did against Tennessee, and that's when Carson Beck had his gravedigger moment on a 2nd and 7 scramble against the Vols, running over a Tennessee safety, igniting the team and rallying them from 10-0 down, and Carson hasn't stopped. And the Dogs had to weather a non-conference game against UMass, a ho-hum game. It was hard for the team to get up, and then Tech comes out, and Buster Faulkner, who knows this Tennessee defense from 3 years on the Georgia staff, and they just pick Georgia apart. They control the clock. They move the ball effectively. They build a 17-0 lead, and they're up 14 when less than 4 minutes left. And we're wondering about Georgia again. And then we see that incredible performance in the final 4 minutes and in the overtimes. The resolve from a Georgia team that's not close to 100% with a scrambled offensive line, receivers dropping 6 passes, and yet still they find a way. And so here we are on the verge of Georgia playing for an SEC championship against a Texas team that they beat 30-15 earlier this season in Austin.
Yeah, and I do want to stop here. On this very program last week, you said Georgia Tech, this is going to be a tough game, and everybody got to listen to it and get, we kind of understood going in. It was not this 20-point spread that they had out in Las Vegas. This was going to be a tight game. They were going to give you your best shot. So credit to you for saying that then. Also last week, you said, we want Texas. Well, Georgia gets Texas this week. Is this the matchup after watching Texas kind of keep Texas A&M at arm's length for most of the night there? Is this the Texas team you want?
It is. Texas had 2 turnovers. Quinn Ewers struggled a little bit. They missed a field goal. They had a punt blocked against an A&M team I'm not exactly sure what to say about, a capable A&M team, but one that perhaps peaked earlier this season. So I think Texas has got some questions about Texas going in. I'm not even sure we're going to see Quinn Ewers. Arch Manning is brewing. Arch Manning is close. And if you're Texas, this is what I wonder, Cody. You know that you're in the playoff, even with a loss. Do you rest Ewers, who's been slowed a little bit by an injury, and maybe give Arch Manning his shot. It serves two purposes. You get Manning some valuable reps, and you suddenly bring in a mobile quarterback that Georgia has struggled against these sort of quarterbacks. Kirby Smart couldn't say enough about Arch Manning today. I think you're going to see a dose of Arch Manning, whether or not he starts or whether they make the change and let Ewers rest and give Manning a shot under the guise of Ewers resting. I'm not sure, but you're seeing a quarterback battle right there where I think Arch Manning is very close to being ready to take over the starting duties and may ultimately have to in order for the Longhorns to win a national championship.
I think that's a dangerous game if you're Texas to put Arch Manning in, not just because he's a freshman out there, but also if he does really well, if Quinn Ewers wouldn't see the field again, because I think kind of the tide has gone the way of Arch Manning. But I do think you'll see more of him, more of Arch Manning, like we saw last week, because of the changeup he throws and because, like you said, the struggles that Georgia's had with a running quarterback so far. It's an interesting thought there. To me, it would be really tough to go full-on Arch Manning starts the game for Texas.
It depends on Quinn Ewers' health. And don't forget, Texas had fallen behind Georgia, so they really weren't in position to run that style of offense with a running quarterback. They had to play catch-up. And clearly, Ewers is more adept at running the offense and throwing the ball, even though I would argue that I think Arch Manning is just as accurate of a passer. And now Kirby believes he can run the entire offense. So Kirby Smart dropped that today. They're very aware of Arch Manning. I think that quarterback situation is one to watch. I think there'll be a scheduled series for Arch just like there was last time, but maybe a little bit sooner, and you might see him in more Wildcat packages. Steve Sarkisian was talking, and we'll have a story up on DawgNation as people are watching this, about how Sark is going to look to approach this as a rematch and what you do when you rematch a team. You look at the things you did well, the things you did not so well, you look at some of your tendencies, and you look to break them. So there's going to be a lot on the table for Kirby Smart and his coaching staff. This Texas team has run the ball effectively. Again, Georgia took them out of that game by building the lead early. Largely because of the Texas turnovers. Georgia that night also overcame some early turnovers, if you'll remember. Carson Beck playing much better. Rod Robinson now back in the fold. So the personality of these teams has shifted ever so slightly with a more capable Arch Manning and a Georgia backfield that's getting healthy with a better Carson Beck at the helm.
Yeah, you talk about rematches for Georgia. They've had a couple of rematches. You had, of course, Auburn. You played in the regular season in 2017. Then you beat them in the SEC championship that year. Of course, Alabama in 2021, you lose to them in the SEC championship game and then end up beating them in the national championship. The only difference is Georgia lost the first game in both of those and then went on to beat the other team in the second game. Now, the first game back October 19th, I don't think we're going to see, Carson Beck. Like you said, he's a little bit different Carson Beck now. I think he has learned, if I just got to tuck it and run or just throw it out of bounds, I'm going to do that. 3 interceptions, I don't think we'll see that number again. I don't know if we'll see 7 sacks again either, and that could be another reason maybe Arch Manning gets more play. He can be a little more mobile, and he can't stand back there and just get attacked from all sides by that Georgia defense.
Yeah, and you have seen Texas give up more sacks lately, so the mobility has been a factor for them. And to your point on Carson, I don't know if it was Carson's decision or Kirby's decision. Remember what Kirby says, they're not practicing to win one game, they're practicing to win all of them. And you really didn't want to expose Carson to a lot of hits earlier in the season. Now, season on the line, you turn him loose. You use every tool in the toolbox because there is no tomorrow if you lose. So I think it's enabled Carson Beck to run the ball more and have a little bit more freedom of when he takes off. I think before they wanted him throwing it away, being careful, because I've said it before, I don't think Georgia has another quarterback on the roster that's capable of leading them to a national title.
What's so crazy about this game is we can talk about it. We can talk about it, and we will talk about it right here on DawgNation.com all week long, right? But you really don't know what you're going to get out of Georgia because they've been consistently inconsistent all year, especially on the defensive side recently. Could they go out there and just dominate and shut Texas up? Yeah, they could. Could they go out there and just give up big play after? Yeah, they've shown that capability as well. That's the crazy thing about this game is that all the smartest people in the room could be talking and they still don't really have a clue because you don't know what team's going to roll out there at Mercedes-Benz Stadium.
Well, it varies depending on a couple of things. One, we don't know who's going to be healthy. I mean, it looks like a different offensive line every week. I mean, every offensive line starter has missed at least 1 week of practice with an injury. The inconsistency at the receiver position. I mean, think about if a catch is made on the first drive against Alabama 48 yards downfield, or if a call's not missed, maybe it's not an interception on the second possession of the game against Alabama. Conversely, there's been times those receivers and tight ends have made plays and Georgia's rolled. So it's been an inconsistency in the receiving core. It's been different lineups because of injuries. And then there's something to be said for the opponent and where the games are played. Playing at Ole Miss is a lot different than playing Ole Miss at Sanford Stadium. As we saw, it went from 52-17 here to 28-10 there. What's the health of the other team? Where is the other team at in the season? I dare say the Georgia team the Kentucky team that Georgia played on the road in September, much different than the one that took the field defeated with season over against Louisville last week. So there's a lot of factors in this. And then finally, I'll say this, and I think we can go back to the Clemson game and reflect. I think Georgia likes to wait until halftime to really show their hand. I think they like to get a read on the room, see how teams are going to line up against formations, not really reveal their pressure packages until after halftime. That way the opponents don't have time to adjust. That way those go-to plays are set up. So I do think that there's a little bit of, I would say, method to the madness, and I think it's been a pretty good formula for Georgia.
Yeah, you talk about those offensive linemen. Obviously, you're playing an 8 overtime game. Those big guys are going to get tired at first, but those guys just getting in and out of the huddle looked really beat down late in that game against Georgia Tech. And you got a week to kind of bounce back. I asked Carson Beck, I said, your tank's got to be on empty after that game. How do you get back up? And, they got their feet up on Saturday, I guess, and that was going to be enough. It'll be interesting to see how they bounce back from just being totally depleted at the end of that Georgia Tech game. But I think the big lights have a tendency to get everybody kind of energized once again.
No doubt about it. And it's nice to see Georgia on the receiving end of the break, where they actually are the team with an extra day's rest. And Texas had to go down to College Station, not really long trip, but still, they were playing Saturday night, and Georgia will have 24 hours more rest. That'll certainly help. Now, Texas hasn't played the schedule Georgia has. If you take a close look at Texas's SEC schedule, Cody, they only played 2 teams in the league that had a better than 500 record in league play, and that was Texas A&M and Georgia. Other than that, all teams in the bottom half of the league with a 500 record or less, Florida being the 500 team, everyone else under 500 that they played. So Texas still not the most tested team. I do think they've gotten better and stronger, but I still wonder a little bit about the validity of their place atop the SEC going into this game.
Really good stuff there. Georgia and Texas, like we said, we'll be talking about it all week long. We're going to take our first break here on The Beat, presented by Ingles. When we come back, boots on the ground. I'll share some of the video I got and some of the exercise that I got on Saturday or Friday night between the hedges. We'll also have Mike's 30,000-foot view, and we'll talk a little playoffs. Who could be in, who could be out from the SEC. We'll see you on the other side of this break.
So, you going to play this week?
You gonna play this week?
You going to play this week?
You gonna play this week?
You going to play this
You
week?
gonna play this week? You gonna play this week?
You going to play this week?
You gonna play this week?
This week. And welcome to the Ingles Game of the Week as the Warhorses square off against our rival.
He's going in.
He's going in. Go, baby!
Ingles, we're with you every step of the way.
Happy to have Ingles a part of the program. I did a little traveling this weekend up to the mountains and filled up at the Ingles there in Blue Ridge, Georgia. It is one of the most impressive stores out there, grocery stores that I've been into. Always get the Ingles Advantage card and get some points off on the gas, too. Not a bad thing. All right, let's do Boots on the Ground. All right, so this is actually going to be a boots on the ground first. It's the first thing we're going to talk about. Technically, I did not shoot video of because I was sticking with Nate Frazier as he scored the game-winning touchdown. I did not make my normal sprint out to the middle of the field to get the coaches shaking hands. And it turns out the coaches were shaking hands and hugging for a very long time. Kirby Smart and Brent Key had this, and this is a great shot from Yosef Shin from the AJC. He had a couple of shots of this moment as they kind of embraced. Across the country this weekend, Mike, we had folks getting pepper sprayed because they're getting in fights, and we had flags being planted and, all kinds of things going on in rivalry games. But here we saw some clean, old-fashioned love.
I think they were too tired to fight. They had all the snaps and overtimes that they played, Cody, and give Brent Key a lot of credit. He got Georgia Tech close, and he says there's no moral victories, but it was a moral victory, and Key basked in the moment because his team played so well, and Kirby basked in the moment because his team had showed so much resolve and resiliency. So I think it was a good moment that they both wanted to enjoy. It was a great football game. It was an instant classic, and who knows, this may be as close to beating Georgia's Brent Key gets. So I think he wants to soak up the moment there.
Is it good for the rivalry this is pregame video that I did shoot, actually. Is it good for rivalry for these guys to be so friendly?
I don't think it makes a difference. I think there's a mutual respect there. I think that's taken the high road. I mean, they will recruit against each other some, but they're very different from one another. I think as former players, there's a different sort of respect they have. You know, Brent Key played for the Jackets and beat Georgia 3 out of 4 times when he was there. I think Kirby Smart's got a lot of respect for those teams that Brent played for and for Brent as a former player. Likewise, I think Brent has a lot of respect for Kirby as a former Bulldog and is the preeminent coach in college football. So I don't think it hurts the rivalry one bit. I think it adds to it that there is this touch of class, as you said, amid a rivalry Saturday when there were all sorts of brawls and ridiculous flag planting moments from kids who've, I guess, grown up playing too many video games.
Now, I will say, if Georgia Tech would have gotten that 1 yard in the 7th overtime, I have no doubt they would have gone over to those hedges and just ripped those hedges apart. Because I've covered that a couple times at Sanford Stadium where they've done it. I interviewed Harrison Butker when he's got a piece of hedge in his mouth. So I think that would have happened, and maybe it wouldn't have been as nice and friendly then, and maybe the Georgia players, because now the Georgia players kind of go off on the other side of the field than they used to. So maybe there would have been a little fracas there, but it was clean, old-fashioned. I guess we won't call it love. We'll call it respect, because it definitely did seem that way. All right, the next piece of video I want to share on Boots on the Ground that I had. I did catch up while kind of that embrace was happening. I followed Tate Ratledge, too, and Tate Ratledge stands there and he says, I never lost in this. Well, you can probably read his lips right there. It was one of those words people were using like at you on Twitter this week, Mike, but he said, I never lost in this place, essentially. Georgia, this 31 straight wins at home. They've gone now 6 straight seasons. So even guys like Dan Jackson, Xavier Truss, who have been there forever, never lost in Sanford Stadium. How impressive a streak is that?
Well, more impressive than ever, Cody, when you consider the amount of parity. This rivals Georgia's back-to-back national championships in the college football playoff, which no team had ever done. Even as the portal opened in 2018, there's more parity than ever. It's designed to be that way. And yet Georgia was able to win back-to-back titles and now tie the SEC record that was set by Alabama with 31 straight home wins. Dare say the Bulldogs will be ready to break that record when next season starts. The records, the list, they just keep coming. You ask why Georgia is the standard for college football. It's streaks like this.
Yeah, really impressive stuff. Now, they're going to get a tough home schedule next year that they'll be tested with, but really impressive stuff. It was cool to see Tate Ratledge kind of embracing that moment. Maybe his last game at Sanford Stadium. Maybe they'll get one more. Who knows? Other guys like Warren Brinson and Jalen Walker kind of enjoyed the moment too, and Warren Brinson kind of stood out there and soaked it in. They had senior day last week, but this really was the last time, and he made sure that Jalen Walker looked out over it because no doubt Jalen will be headed off to the NFL last year. All right, we always try to end Boots on the Ground on a kind of a fun note. And the one thing I will remember from this game was what somebody online called the migration. And it was watching all the photographers run back and forth across the field because overtime kept happening on different sides of the field. So you could see after Georgia failed there, all right, everybody got to get up. Now we got to go down to the other end. Kirby Smart even talked about it in his post game. He said, I saw y'all huffing and puffing going up and down the field. I kind of compared it the end of football practice when you got to run gassers. That's kind of the way it felt, having to go back and forth. And then the TV truck there, he was always in the way. So we made it 7 times back and forth just to make sure we could get the shot when Nate Frazier finally scored. And luckily we did get the shot. But that was one of those things that if you're watching on TV, maybe you don't appreciate. But it had a lot of run. It made me feel better my Thanksgiving meal. I'll say that.
I'll tell you, Cody, you brought a lot of insight into your job and your position. And if there's any aspiring young television journalists or cameramen out there, they have a lot they can learn from you and from watching the program. I find it interesting. That's one of those things that you just don't think about. And that's what's been cool about this Boots on the Ground segment is some of the candid shots you've gotten and some of the insight that you've been able to produce that people wouldn't ordinarily know. I mean, the college football game is such a show. There's so many cameras. There's so much going on. And I think the insights that you've provided, I've learned a lot. And I didn't even realize how much running it back and forth that you guys were doing. So that's a pretty cool shot. It's a lot of fun to think about. And the reason Kirby probably brought it up is he's probably feeling pretty tired himself. And so he looked around and said, gosh, those guys got to run even further than I do. So it was pretty neat and pretty interesting that they flip sides. I'm not sure what I think about this overtime rule, Cody. I'm not sure that I like that it's decided from the 3-yard line after all that football. To me, it just doesn't seem organic enough. It seems pretty gimmicky. Interestingly enough, though, you would have thought that would have benefited Georgia Tech with their ability to run the ball versus Georgia, and yet it turned out just the opposite. It was the Bulldogs that benefited with Carson Beck making the right call at the line to give Frazier the ball in the game-winning play.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Do you do it maybe like the NFL does? Even they get criticized a little bit. But yeah, it does feel gimmicky, I think is the exact right word for that. We'll see if changes are made after 8 overtimes, the second longest game in college football history. That is Boots on the Ground, but now we're going to talk about the big picture of Mike's 30,000-foot view. Well, we saw Ohio State go down. We saw some great rivalry matchups, and now all the politicking starts for all these teams, Mike.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you're staring right down the barrel of Alabama finding a way in again, Cody. We're looking at these 3-loss SEC teams, primarily Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina. And the College Football Playoff Committee, by ranking Alabama the highest of those 3 teams going into last weekend, kind of set the wheels in motion. I don't know that I agree with that ranking last week. Personally, I feel like Ole Miss was the best of those 3 teams. Now, that's the eye test, and obviously they fared better against Georgia than anyone, but yet and still, really like that Ole Miss team the best. And I would also make an argument for South Carolina. When you look at the momentum the Gamecocks have generated, the one loss they had at home that was so controversial against LSU, that call still very much in question. You'd hate to think a call like that could keep a team out of the playoff, but it appears that's exactly what's happened to South Carolina. They'd be a 2-loss team otherwise. And yet still, we're looking at Alabama as we play out the various projections. The Crimson Tide taking care of business at home against Auburn, a team with a very high ceiling, certainly capable of winning the national championship, but a team that also has fallen flat, as we saw against Oklahoma, losing by 3 touchdowns to one of the lower half SEC teams. So that's fascinating to me. We'll all tune in Tuesday night, tomorrow night at 7 p.m. On ESPN. You can see that College Football Playoff Committee ranking show, and that should set the order and give us an idea of what might happen depending on how the relative conference championship games play out. Then we're also going to look and see, well, what are they going to do with those teams that lose in the conference championship game? We're not going to find that out until Sunday at noon when they have the selection show after the SEC championship games and the other conference championship games are played on Saturday. Does the committee protect the teams to some degree, provided they're not blown out or they don't lose a star quarterback or pivotal player? Do they protect the teams that play in the conference championship games, or do they drop them beneath teams with the same or perhaps one fewer loss that didn't make it into the conference championship game? And Georgia is probably the most intriguing case. I think some of them are pretty cut and dry. I think we know that Clemson has to beat SMU to get into the playoff. They're not going to get an at-large bid. I think we know that whoever loses the Big 12 championship game is going to be out. I think we recognize that in the Big Ten, it doesn't matter whether it's Oregon that loses or Penn State, the other team will make the playoffs. So in other cases, I think it's a little bit more clear cut. But you drop Georgia into that 3-loss pool, and it's really in the hands of the committee. Do they say, well, Georgia has 3 losses just like Alabama and Ole Miss, and those teams beat them head to head? Or if you say no chance that happens, then you ask, do they drop a 3-loss Georgia behind a 2-loss Tennessee that Georgia beat just 2-3 weeks ago, albeit in Sanford Stadium? That affects whether or not Georgia could host another game at Sanford Stadium in the first round of the playoffs in December 20th or 21st, or if they would have to travel to another place. Now, most Dog fans are saying, hey, they just need to win and go to the Sugar Bowl on January 1st and we can all enjoy Christmas. I think most fans are on board with that. But if the Dogs lose, things are going to get very interesting in how those seedings work and where Georgia ends up starting the college football playoff, presuming the CFP selection committee doesn't do the unthinkable and drop them out of the playoff. I just can't imagine that scenario, Cody.
Yeah, that would be hard. A few points there. First off, we'll be reacting to the college football selections right here on DawgNation and your YouTube channel, DawgNation.com, right after that happens on Sunday. So please join Brandon Adams, everybody, for that. So we will have that for you. One of the other things, I wouldn't put anything past the committee. So I do think, but there's a chance that Georgia loses, especially how they lose. They could find a way to not put them in there. That wouldn't totally blow my mind because, they left them out after losing the SEC championship last year. I do wonder, any of those SEC 3-loss teams that get in, you got to feel like they're going to be dangerous, to all of these Big Ten teams or whoever, one of these ACC conference champions that they end up having to play down the road. An SEC team will be dangerous. Now, the big question of the Ole Miss, Bama, or South Carolina, is part of it just the brand of Alabama? You think that helps that?
Well, I would ask you, Cody, what game do you think would get more attention? Alabama at Notre Dame, Ole Miss at Notre Dame, or South Carolina at Notre Dame? Because it appears to me that if chalk holds, Notre Dame will be that 5 seed and get to host the number 12 seed. I also think that the winner of the Big 12 will be elevated over that 3-loss SEC at-large team that I expect to get a bid.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, they paid a lot of money for these contracts, right? They need TV numbers, so that's part of it, and that's something none of us should forget. And it was interesting to see kind of Lane Kiffin went out there on Twitter and put his whole argument for his team right out there. Something we saw Nick Saban do a lot when, Alabama was, should they be in or should they not be in? Is it something that you can see? I don't think Shane Beamer has any shame in going out there and do that. Do you think Kalen DeBoer is kind of that same guy too? Will he be out there kind of on the front lines for his team?
He can be on the front lines, but they're going to need Nick Saban to retweet it because he's the guy with 7 national championships that everybody listens to. It's unfortunate for Lane in the sense that I do think he has the best of those 3 teams. If you were going to ask me who the best team was of those 3, I do think the Rebels. Remember they went into South Carolina and beat them 27-3 earlier this year, so they get the nod from me because they beat the Gamecocks in Columbia. Alabama and Ole Miss didn't play this year. I think that worked to the detriment of both of those programs. I do think Alabama has the highest ceiling, but I have a hard time rewarding a team that's been as wildly inconsistent as the Tide has. That 24-3 loss to Oklahoma is a bad look. The road loss to Vanderbilt, albeit as good a Vanderbilt team as we've seen in a long time, that's still a bad look for the Crimson Tide. And I do agree with you that despite what the committee may say, I do think the brand plays a role.
I feel like depending on what happens to the loser of the SEC championship game, and obviously the Big Ten as well, what happens, how far they fall. But if a team like Georgia gets dropped way down and they've got to all of a sudden go on the road in the first round, or they, like we said, potentially didn't make the playoff, I think that would set a bad precedent. And I think if you're, Greg Sankey, you got to think, is this SEC championship game, what can we do here to make sure this doesn't happen? Because it seems like there's going to be nobody wanting to play in that thing next year if something happens bad to the loser of this game.
Yeah, well, they can't change the format for next year. I think it's pretty much etched in stone. This contract runs, one more year. I think starting in 2026 is when you have a new contract. The playoffs could be expanded. And I think you learned some lessons from this. I think there's some provisions that could be put in place. We've heard some scuttlebutt about, the SEC and Big Ten wanting to ensure that they each have 4 teams in. That would make the SEC championship game relevant again in terms of being able to guarantee both the teams that play in it playoff spots. So I do think there will be some guardrails put in. It's been a learning curve for the SEC. There's been a lot of talk. Do they go to 9 conference games? Well, that depends on how the committee views their one-loss record. I think the committee has let us know they don't value the SEC schedule strength enough to warrant a 9th SEC game. I think they need to stick with 8, even though 9 would be more attractive for the television contract, unless you put those provisions in that 4 teams get in to the 12 or perhaps 16 team playoff, I don't think the SEC can move forward with 9 conference games. Now, because of that, and you talked money earlier, I do think we'll see those provisions. I do think we'll see a 9th game. And unfortunately, this is just a year where somebody's got to pay the price for what I believe has been a very self-serving Ward Manuel, athletic director at the University of Michigan, as the Big Ten has been ranked higher based on their putting a priority on one-loss record rather than applying schedule strength in the eye test to the formula.
When you look at it, though, and you consider where we've been with the playoff the last couple of years, if you're one of those teams, if you're the Ole Miss that gets left out, or you're the South Carolina, or if Alabama somehow gets left out, can you really be that upset when you look at it and you say, hey, man, we lost to Kentucky at home if you're Ole Miss. We lost to Vanderbilt. Did we really deserve to be in? Can you look yourself in the mirror as a fan base and be okay with it, do you think? Or do you think it's like that argument, it'll be just like it was if you were the 5th team out of the 14 playoffs?
Well, a lot of mixed feelings, and those are the arguments, and those are the things that the coaches and the fan bases, have to examine within themselves. But at the same time, Cody, we were kind of sold a bill of goods that was about the best teams, not the most deserving. And I think these rankings have proven just the opposite. I think by going with one-loss record, you're saying, well, if this team only lost 1 game, then they should be ranked ahead of a team that loses 2 games. Or let's look at the statistics, and they rank here in, Conference B. Conference B is not as good as Conference A. I don't think you can lean on the statistics. I think you need to look at hypotheticals. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, you got to throw hypotheticals out the window because you don't know. And I say, well, maybe you're right. But I do have 10 years of college football playoff experience that I can look at. And over the last 10 years, the SEC produced 10 of the 20 teams that played for national championships. The SEC won 4 of the last 5 college football playoffs. The SEC has had more players drafted into the NFL draft each year the last 19 years. I have a hard time just ignoring those metrics and pretending that data and that information, that historical significance, unless you think, and I don't have reason to believe to, that the SEC is just suddenly fallen completely off the map. So that's why I say I think they're applying a very convenient logic to this, and I don't necessarily think it's fair. So if you're Ole Miss, you say, well, you know what? Maybe we got 3 losses, but we beat that Indiana team, by 4 touchdowns. Because after all, what is Indiana's best win? What is Penn State's best win? So you really didn't hold up the standard of getting the best teams in there. You ended up going with the most deserving, and that's not what everyone agreed on.
And I think that's why the SEC teams, if they get in, it don't matter where you send them, they are going to be dangerous, and they're going to prove that point. And maybe after this year, if you get a team going into Bloomington and blowing somebody out or whatever it is, maybe they'll listen next year a little more. All right, time for another break here on The Beat. When we come back, it'll be our Anytime Heating, Cooling, and Plumbing Who's Hot and Who's Cold segment.
I'm so glad you're here.
Let's take a look.
Anytime can handle all your HVAC and plumbing needs, providing top quality service for a reasonable price.
All fixed now.
Can we call you again?
Yes, anytime. Any day? Yes, anytime.
But for the heat?
Yes, anytime. For the toilet? Yes, anytime. Anytime you have a problem, just call.
Anytime Heating, Cooling, and Plumbing. Large enough to handle your HVAC needs, but small enough to care.
Good number to have, especially as the holidays approach. That time may come, and you may need them very, very quickly. All right, it's time for our Who's Hot and Who's Cold segment. Who's hot this week, Mike?
Carson Beck. Carson Beck was not bothered by the 6 drop passes. He played through it. I thought he was clutch. I thought he was near flawless in the end. I thought the 3rd and 9 scramble on the game-tying drive hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. Carson not turning the ball over, making good decisions, showing good leadership. I mean, this is a guy who is now firmly in control of his team. I think Carson has matured right before our eyes. I think he realizes that he has to take ownership, and albeit not the most talented receiving core around him, but it's his receiving core. And I think that Carson has put this team on his shoulders. I think his dual threat ability as a runner is a game changer for this Georgia offense. I think his experience has kicked in. I think he's red hot. I think C.J. Allen is red hot too. You know, it was C.J. Allen who made a tremendous play to knock down a pass there when Georgia Tech had a 4th down. They were one play from getting in field goal range that could have won the game in regulation, and C.J. came up with the play. And then you fast forwarded to that 7th overtime when I talked about Georgia Tech needing only 1 yard and Haynes King calling his own number, and it was C.J. Allen on the stop. So C.J. Allen, Carson Beck, and how could we forget Dirty Dan Jackson in the hit that he put on Haynes King to force that fumble. Not saying that the Dogs couldn't have driven all the way down the field, but it sure was helpful that they got to start at the 32-yard line. Thanks to that big hit, you're seeing it right there that Dan put on Haynes King. A lot of people claiming that was targeting, but you can see that referees were all over that play in perfect position. And one thing we know, they're not afraid to call targeting on Georgia. We saw 2 of these guys ejected at Texas, and that led DawgNation to get a one-on-one interview with the head of national officiating, Steve Shaw, and he explained it, and people can read it. But for now, the Fringe fans can complain about it and cry in their tears. Dan Jackson with the biggest play on defense and regulation helped turn this game around for the Bulldogs. That's who's hot.
Yeah, and talking about the targeting, you look at the Dom Lovett's touchdown, the dude came in there, flew in there, and you kind of saw him in our video. He kind of stumbles afterwards because, yeah, he got hit in the head and neck area with a helmet coming right in at him. So it could have been called both ways, so we will say that. I will say also hot, Cash Jones always seems to be so clutch. I love watching Cash Jones as well. Talk about the walk-ons, Dan Jackson, North Hall Trojan, got Cash Jones, who will be playing, against Texas as home state, so that's going to be interesting to watch this week. All right, that's who's hot. Who's cold this week, Mike?
Wow, you got to say the College Football Playoff Committee's been pretty cold with these rankings, Cody. They've got a mess to sort out right now because of these rankings they put out. What do you do with the Ohio State that was number 2 and they lose to a mediocre Big Ten team? That's going to create a problem for them to justify where they put the Ohio State. They're going to have to show their hand. If they don't drop Ohio State behind Tennessee, I think there's going to be some serious noise made. I think, again, we're going to look at what they do with the conference championship teams. Awful cold. And Texas A&M, poor Texas A&M. They've been in the league for 13 years, and they haven't been able to reach the SEC championship game. And in year 1, Texas gets this favorable schedule and gets to the league title game. And A&M's going, but wait a minute, we had to compete with Nick Saban every year in the SEC West. Texas didn't have to do that. And those Longhorns, they're not going to hear it. They'll be like, look, we just showed up and we're in. A&M, you're out. You had us at home. You had your chance. We fought. We turned the ball over twice, missed a field goal, had a punt blocked. Go home, Aggies, back to College Station. Texas A&M, ice cold right now, Cody.
Yeah, you talk about it. You'll have 14 teams in the SEC cheering for Georgia because they just don't want to see Texas come in that first year and win the SEC.
Now, will they? But will they? But will they?
I think
will they really? Will they?
If at this point you got to choose, I think you don't want the team who came in the first year. Oh yeah, we just win this thing. That's easy. We won the Big 12 last year. We'll win this one. I think they want to show the SEC's a little tougher, and it goes through Georgia. So I do think that they'll be kind of on Georgia's side. Cold this week too, Ryan Day, man. That if you're talking about eye test, Ohio State can't get a first down in the fourth quarter. You talk about Georgia being clutch and the way they finished games. You got to be able to do something. And, yeah, you're right. That's going to be interesting to see how they treat Ohio State because that's another game where everybody was watching. And so you're going to get picked apart, and there's no question about it. So, and can you fire Ryan Day because he can't beat one team? I think you probably can, but I don't know that they will up there, right?
Well, here's a question for you. Could Ohio State be better off not playing in the Big Ten championship game where they may have lost to Oregon and had to turn around and play 2 weeks than where they'll be right now assured of a playoff spot? I mean, Ohio State basically just got themselves an extra week off. Now, granted, they'll have to pick up that extra game on the back end, but they don't have to play Oregon. They don't have to be on that stage. Now, I'm not saying that Ohio State went out there and rolled over against Michigan because they didn't. They'd lost that game, 3 years in a row, now 4, and certainly Ryan Day is under fire. But don't be surprised if this doesn't work out for the Buckeyes because now they're going to get a little more time off. They may still get a home game depending on how you work out the projections. And they're going to be a very dangerous team in the playoff. Remember, Ohio State had lost to Michigan before they played Georgia in 2022, and we saw one hell of an effort from those Buckeyes in that CFP Peach Bowl semifinal. They gave the Dogs all they wanted. They went to work. They went to school. Say whatever you want. They took Georgia to the final second before midnight after losing to Michigan. So don't write off Ohio State and Ryan Day quite yet. To me, they remain one of the top 2 or 3 national championship contenders in the playoff.
It brings us all the way back around, Mike, because you know what they say. You play to win the game. Like we said about Georgia Tech, it's about who wins and loses, not how great Ohio State. But yes, Ohio State was very good that day, but Georgia.
And who knows? Maybe it saved Sharon Moore's job and everybody in the Big Ten celebrating, because I don't think he's a very good head coach.
Yeah, very interesting there, too. All right, so Georgia now has 2 games to win 1 to move on to New Year's Day, right? So it's an interesting way to think about it. Georgia and Texas this week. If you had to pick one thing that you're most interested in this game, what would it be?
The injury report. I want to see who can play for the Dogs. I think Kirby kind of dropped a hint that ETN may not be ready, but I was impressed with Rod Robinson, and it sounds like Kirby was too. Did pretty good for his first game playing tackle football in a long time. This can be a game changer. That's a 235-pound battering ram. Georgia had some issues and some short yardage. I like Rod Robinson being back. I think that's big. And this offensive line, right? We know they played all these snaps, same with the defense, a lot of snaps, but can these Dogs get healthy enough to hold their own in the trenches against a really talented Texas team? So I'll be watching first quarter, the line of scrimmage, which way does it move? I'd give Georgia the quarterback advantage. I don't know that we would have said that halfway through the season. Love the way Carson Beck's playing. Can these receivers, are there some gloves out there? Are they allowed to wear gloves anymore, Cody?
Stick 'em.
Stick them. I mean, can the receiver, if the receivers just start catching the ball, it's going to look like a Georgia offense that's more capable because drives will be sustained. So to me, those are kind of the key factors. I'm picking Georgia to win this game. I don't mind giving you that pick early on. I like their momentum. I think Texas is still suspect, and I think Steve Sarkisian knows that.
Really hard to beat a team twice, though, Mike.
It's happened before, and I don't think these are the same teams. I think that both of these teams have had changes. We talked about the Texas quarterback situation earlier in the program. If or when Arch Manning gets in, what effect might that have? Is the gamble worthwhile? Does Texas need a mobile quarterback to move the ball on a Georgia defense that was in their backfield all night in Austin earlier this season?
Going to be really fun to watch, and we'll get to hear from the players and coaches a lot this week and follow along with everything we've got going on DawgNation.com. Mike will be all over it writing as well. And then, like we said, SEC Championship Day, we will be out at our DawgNation Invasion tailgate before the game. Well, Kaylee will be live out there. We'll have the wrap-up show post-game, and then the College Football Playoff reaction show on Sunday. So a big week for us here on DawgNation. We appreciate you spending a little time with us here on The Beat, presented by Ingles. And we will see you next Monday with the future of the Dogs, then known